One of my students. So today we're going to continue our conversation in the sense that we're going to look at now the theoretical frames. The previous lecture, lecture 3, centered on social stratification, right? And so we, in a sense, dealt with 3 Ps. And so today's conversation, we're going to kind of build on that discourse, all right? Specifically through the different functions of theory, right? And this is important because each theory will look at social stratification from a different theoretical lens. And so we're going to talk about today the key theorists in sociology, right? And now this is important because when we're talking in relation to social stratification, and it's essential that you make a note of these terms that I'm about to discuss, because there's a probability that there will be an exam. So first and foremost, let's talk about, well, what does social stratification consist of, right? And I know I already slightly touched on this in the previous lecture. We're in a sense dealing with social class, right? And social class is the occupations that each and every one of us occupy within society, right? And so these occupations are reflective of our income and wealth, right? And so when we're talking about social class, we are making reference to what group in society we belong to in relation to our income and wealth, right? And again, this is a 3 Ps: power, property, and prestige. And so here we're making a note of upper class, middle class, and lower class, right? And so we're gonna be discussing these three kind of frames as we move into the theories. Now, what is a theory? A theory is a system of ideas intended to explain a phenomenon, right? And theories are used to connect different facets of society, for example, because and next week we'll talk about the how sociology is actually a science, and so we're gonna see this notion of theory again. But when we're saying a theory is that a theory allows us to connect an isolated incident at a specific point in time to a general social issue, right? And so it's an application to look at complex social issues. And so that is the function of a theory, right? So think of it when someone says, oh, that's an isolated incident. By using a certain theoretical frame, that allows you to connect it to a more complex relationship. And so theories are not bounded by time and space, right? So in a second, we'll look at inequality for conversation's sake. And we're gonna learn that based on different theorists, that someone might look at inequality or racial inequality in 1950 or 20s, right, and still relate it to conversations of racial inequality in 2022, right, or 21. And so if you notice, that conversation is unbounded, because someone can say, well, that was a different epoch, right? And so they had their own norms and values. And so with theory, it allows you to connect it to a larger conversation or issue, right? And so this is all relevant in relation to this conversation of social class, right? Because when we're talking about social class, we're in a sense looking at the way people move, okay? And so again, these are some key terms to remember. Intergenerational mobility, again, intergenerational mobility. And what intergenerational mobility is, people that can move within a certain social class, right? So let's say, for example, your family, you might be working class, but you're getting your college education, right? And that way you can become middle class. If you noted, that is still within that, immediate generational family dynamic, right? And so that is generational. It's also generational if you look at individuals, right? So let's say, for example, because if your family comes from working class, you yourself were raised in a working class family, but through education, your goal is to move to middle class, right? And so if you notice is that you start off in one category and you move on to another category, right? Social class. So that becomes intergenerational. Um, it's the other situation that can happen is that, let's say, for example, you were upper class, right? But through economic hardship, all of a sudden now you move into a lower class, right? So that is still intergenerational mobility. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, so remember intergenerational mobility. And so we assume as though this mobility coincides with certain situations that the individual can control, right? And this is why these theories are so powerful, which we're going to explore. And because the conversation changes into this other component called occupational mobility. Occupational mobility. And so that is situations that happen outside the control of the individual, right? So think of how we're moving now into a service industry or a biotech industry, right? And so all of a sudden you had individuals that follow the norms and values of society, right? So think of the individuals, parents, grandparents, siblings that might work in the mills and factories, or in coal, and all of a sudden the structure is shifting, right? And so now you have these layoffs and displacements. That is occupational mobility, right? And so if you know that is not within the control of the individual, that is happening outside of their control, right? And so then those individuals need to be trained in something else, and that's why it becomes occupational, right? All of a sudden now they have to be trained, retrained in, say, technology, and so they have, and so a lot of companies, those are good and try to help the workers. They make sure that they provide funds for their workers to get certified or to go pick up a new vocational skill, right? And when their factories are closing, and I know that Texas did this with certain factories that closed down, that they gave funds to their employees that pay a 2-year tuition for their employees to get trained in another vocation, right? So they can find a decent living wage. And so that is occupational mobility, right? Is that they're moving from one craft skill to another, right? And so this also happens within the structure, right? And so here within occupation mobility, what is also occurring is what's referred to as structural mobility, structural mobility. And that is movement because of things that are happening in the global context, right? And so think of the conversation at a structural, at a global frame, we're moving from fossil fuel to green energy, right? You hear that a lot. And so that is that is structural. Same thing happened with in the 1920s, right? Where individuals were, or even a late 18th century, early 19th century, where means of large transportation was still through carriages and horses, right? It wasn't until the Model T, or the steam engine, started making its appearance, right? In the 1910s and 1920s, right, that you saw this shift. And so all of a sudden now you had this drastic movement in society where certain individuals gain different occupations and such, right? And so if you notice is that you have those mobility situations happening in structure. And so theory bounds those conversations, right? So we're going to talk about those key theories. Again, the key concepts to remember here, aside from these slides, is what is social class, right? And intergenerational mobility, occupational mobility, and structural mobility, right? Okay, so who is one of the key theorists? First and foremost, and we all know this individual, right? Most of us, and we kind of make a certain assumption about them that, in a sense, kind of makes us uncomfortable, right, when we hear it, because all of a sudden it's communism, communism, communism. And so the first person we're going to talk about is Karl Marx. And so Karl Marx is a theorist. He is known for his contribution to the conversation, was referred to as conflict theory, right? And so conflict theory for Marx, what he argues is that there's an institution where power, it is it's concentrated within a few individuals, or within a small group, right? And so so for him, what Marx emphasizes is that that the person by nature, right, the person by nature is good. And so this is where it gets pretty interesting, because Marx emphasizes the idea of a utopia system. What he's saying is, through information and knowledge, individuals will awaken from their exploitation. So, and I have exploitation out here, and I'll talk about that in a second, what that entails. But what he's saying here is that by nature, we're good, right? We always want to do good. We always want to help, right? But something in the structure, something that we encounter, corrupts us. And so then we become selfish, right? And so for him is that there are certain structural positions that corrupts the individual. And so inequality happens, right? Abuse happens, inequality happens, because there is a group of individuals or a specific structure that takes advantage of everyone else, right? And so in conflict theory is that you're always taking advantage, right? And so that is referred to exploitation, obviously that again. And so that's in conflict theory. Now, in conflict theory, Marx actually divides these into two categories: the capitalists and the proletariats. So the capitalists, also known as the bourgeoisies. And so the bourgeoisies, what he argues, is those that owns the means of production, right? These are the wealthy. Those are the capitalists. The proletariats are the working, right? And so the only thing that the workers have, and they own themselves, is their labor power, all right? So the capitalists own the means of production. So here we're talking about the raw resources. So there's an assumption, it's like, oh, so like say, for example, a dealership at Delaney, I'm referring to a dealership here locally, right? The Delaney, would they be considered capitalists? The answer is no, because they might own like the property, but they don't own the actual vehicles, right? Those vehicles come from a factory. So think of it in this sense. If you get a recall on your car, right, or your vehicle, your means of transportation, and you take it to your dealership needs to honor that warranty, right? Or else you can, kind of complain, and it will get rectified. And the reason being is because they don't own it, right? They don't own that particular vehicle, okay? That they get it on I don't know how it's set up, maybe like in a lease, or they have a contract, right? That they get a certain percentage. But but if you notice, is that all, that is, kind of centralized in, say, in the Ford family, right? Which nobody knows where they live. I don't know where they live, but that is because that's where the capitals live, right? And so they own the means of production, right? They own the resources, they own the distribution, they own everything, right? So this will be an example of Carnegie, okay? Carnegie was a capitalist. He owns the means of production, right? He owned the mills, and then he started owning the railroads, and then the resources, right? And he owned the railroads, so he can also own the natural resources, right? So he was kind of, in a sense, developing a monopoly. So that is a capitalist. Everybody else is the proletariats, workers. And the only thing you have value over is your labor power. And this is what gets exploited. Your labor power is that based on the structural mobility, the structure itself, remember, this is why we talked about structural mobility and intergenerational mobility, is that your labor power has a certain value, right? So think of why, right? We want to increase the minimum wage to 15, right? And society's like, no, how dare you, increase the wage to $15 and for flipping burgers, right? And that is the claim. But and so for us, we as a society, when I mean us, I'm referring to as a society, we don't feel, or at a certain point we didn't feel. Now, granted, now that is changing, right? Because now all of a sudden, I'm using quotations here, now we have these groups that we call the essential workers, right? And so now we understand their values. But before, right, before COVID, we diminished them, right? We undervalue their importance to society, to the structure. And so that is their labor power, right? And so that is the only thing, as a proletariat, as a worker, you have control, right? Is that your labor power has a certain value. And that's what gets exploited. Now, exploited means that the structure or the individual in position of power will try to always get more profit at the least cost for them and at the least amount they can have to pay for your labor power. That is the exploitation, right? What's being exploited is your labor power. How much are you worth? Okay. Now, your labor power is in conjunction with your social class, right? So think of doctors, right? They get a certain kind of wealth, right? And we attribute that level of education, right? And it goes back to our, going back to our norms of a merit system, right? As well, they had all these trainings. Of course, they need to get paid, right? And the argument is about the billionaires, right? Like, oh my gosh, like, of course, they should get paid, X millions and billions of dollars, right? For their contribution, for their labor power. However, when you actually break it down into labor, right? They really don't contribute that much for the amount they're getting. So they're, in a sense, they're getting like $1.6 million for 1 hour of whatever work they're supposed to be doing, right? But we know, based on, for those of you who are taking political economics or political corporate kind of modeling and understanding globalization, like, wait, there's a lot of consolidation, right? Is that these large companies buy smaller companies, right? And then they're integrated, right? And that's what happened with Fiat. Okay. Now, with certain motor vehicle mega companies or manufacturers, right? Mega manufacturers, instead of developing their groundbreaking electrical car, they just bought off, those smaller companies that already were investing in electrical cars, with the exception of this new truck that won truck of the year, right? Motor Trend, sorry, not just truck, but Motor Trend of 2022. But in due time, that's probably going to get consolidated into one of the larger motor companies, right? And so we'll be interested to see which one. So that's what gets exploited, right? And so that is what exploitation means, is that you're being exploited. Now, interesting enough about exploitation is that all of us, even those individuals who own Delaney, are being exploited. What changes is the level of exploitation, right? Is that if you're upper class, right, you're getting exploited, but not at the rate of someone who is working poor, right? Or the lower, what is it? Upper class, middle, lower class, right? That someone in lower class gets exploited at a higher rate than someone who's upper class. But here in exploitation is you're still being exploited. Now, this is where Marx gets interesting about exploitation. So for Marx, the exploitation is that all of us are being exploited. So even if those of you like, no, I'm not being exploited, he says yes. And the reason why you're being exploited is because you don't even know your exploitation, right? And this is where certain individuals have issue with it. So the fact that you're saying you're not being exploited is a reflection of how you're being exploited, right? for conflict is you can't see your exploitation until it's measured against something else, right? I taught at a liberal arts college where the educational dynamic was very different than here at IUP. Okay, and so, for example, students refer to their professors by their first name. It wasn't until I came here that I got that I had to get used to being referred to as Dr. Molina, right, instead of just by my first name. Also, classroom dynamics were very different. As a professor, I wasn't allowed to sit in the classroom when students were taking an exam. And so this was all part of the institutional ethos, right? And so just think of that dynamic, right? And why is it important? Because when you're considering going into like an elite graduate program, or or being innovative and thinking outside the box, right? These are the individuals you're competing against, right? These are individuals you're going to be competing against. And so the argument is that there, right, there'll be, you can see that level of exploitation, okay? And so at the same time of exploitation, you encounter what's referred to as alienation. And alienation, what it is a disconnection. You're disconnected from everything. You're disconnected from the institution. You're disconnected from each other, right? Now, alienation, what this entails for Marx is that you're disconnected from the fact that you're being taken an advantage, but not only you, those around you are also being taken advantage. Now, granted, their exploitation and alienate, their exploitation might be slightly less or more severe than yourself, but regardless, there is exploitation occurring, right? And so he refers to this as alienation. And that's what that means, right? It's that you're disconnected from everybody and everything, okay? The only thing you become concerned is just doing your work. 1984 is a good example of this, okay? Of individuals being disconnected and they want to hear it, right? And so that is alienation, right? So think of this, this push for false media, fake media, you hear that a lot, right? That is in a sense alienating individuals from learning about what's going on in other facets and structurals, right? We're not going to be talking about media sociology, media discourse, just because of the constraint of time, but typically we'll spend, not the full lecture, but some time deconstructing the role of the media in communication, right? As it, fits into the dynamics of the power elites. All right. So for Marx, is that once you learn that you're being exploited, right, and that you understand your alienation from those around you, what he emphasizes this thing called waking of consciousness, right? A waking of consciousness. A waking of consciousness is that you, you see all of a sudden like, whoa, wait, something's going on here, right? This is not right. And so that is a waking of consciousness. Okay. Marx emphasized revolution. Okay. Now, and you hear this a lot, this emphasis of revolution. That is conflict theory, and that is Marx. Now, what interesting enough, there is some misconception what is meant by revolution. Some assume that, it was like, marching into the Capitol with pitchforks. No, what he's saying in relation to revolution is an awakening of, of knowledge and information, right? It's being able to see your exploitation, right? You're able to note that the structure is taking advantage of you. Someone is taking advantage, right? Your employer is taking advantage of you. All of a sudden, there is like this push for micromanagement, right? That they monitor, what you can and cannot do, right? And so that's, in a sense, is disconnecting you from other individuals, right? So here is an example of evaluations. You're always being evaluated based on your performances, right? And so that, and by default, is you're being alienated because you can't deviate from what you're doing, or else you become, later when we get into Durkheim, become obsolete, okay? But for Marx, what he's saying is there's the revolution of waking of consciousness. Again, waking of consciousness, right? It's when you have your aha moment, like, oh, I learned, like, wow, I'm seeing this now. That is a waking of consciousness, and that is a revolution. The revolution is internal, right? It's not revolting, kind of marching and taking over, an institution. For Marx is awakening of consciousness. So that is Marx. So the next individual we're going to talk about is Max Weber. Yes, I know it's a W. And we want to refer to them as Weber. No, because he is German. And so you pronounce his name as Weber. I remember because my background's in crim. And so when I went to grad school and Soch, I refer to him as Max Weber in one of the class conversations in the master's program. And there were some individuals there who were theorists in the program. And they're like, ha, 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 his name is Weber. And like, you assholes. But yes, his name is Weber, right? And so Max Weber came after the death of Marx. And so what Max Weber emphasizes is this counterframe of structure, right? Because remember, for Marx, there's an institution that takes advantage of you, right? Exploitation and waking of consciousness, where people will question their reality, right? And that is attributed to exploitation, marginalization, this conflict between workers and those who own the means of production, known as capitalists, also the bourgeoisies, again, bourgeoisies. And so what what Weber emphasizes is that, you know what, people really don't care, right? People really don't care if they're upper class, middle class, lower class. What Weber says is like, all we care, right, is that we're okay. And so he refers to this as rationalization. And so what he's saying is that people rationalize the pros and cons to a situation, right? For Weber, what he emphasized is that people rationalize their situation. And so, and they rationalize it through this thing called the pros and cons. So this is the way he first foremost tackled this. He tackled it to what was referred to as the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Again, let me repeat that. The Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Right. So first and foremost, what he's saying is that as a society, we didn't care that we had to work. We didn't care. Because what we wanted to know is that we're going to get a reward in the afterlife, right? And this, again, is attributed to the United States infancy development, right, through Calvinism, right? For purpose of exam, you don't need to really know the in-depth what Calvinism is, but just understand that for Weber, is individuals started to associate their reflection of working hard as the reward for the afterlife, right? And so all of a sudden, people started attributing their position in society to their material gains, right? And so people are rationalized in that sense, is that we give value to objects. Okay. And so what for us is that for us, what's important, right? And this is where Weber engages into conversation of sociology is first and foremost, right? That was the infancy is through the spirit, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, is that all of a sudden individuals were working hard, they were being frugal, and they weren't spending a lot of money, and therefore, because you really didn't need to have a lot of money as long as you were in good standings with the divine, right? And then this later transcended into this attachment to objects in the physical world. And so what he attributes is that people are fine if you're not the Rockefellers or the Kennedys or the Bushes, right? If you're not, these very wealthy artists, right? As long as you can consume what they have. And so this is where he gets into this idea of status symbols, right? Is that you're okay with being in debt as long as you can buy something that is status, right? So this could be, think of, the name brand clothes and vehicles, right? Like, for example, this Porsche. I think this is a Porsche. So it doesn't matter if you're upper class, but as long as you can consume those objects in the upper category, you're okay, right? And so for him, that is important. This is how people rationalize their position as individuals. Like, yes, granted, I might be working class, but guess what? I have, I have a roof over my head, right? I have a new cell phone, or I can, occasionally go and treat myself. So that is those status symbols. Okay, is they give us a certain position in society. Now, granted, most of these status symbols place us in debt. Remember what we discussed, what the purpose of debt is, but we don't care, right? As long as we can buy, like, $400 sneakers, right? Vintage Air Jordans or something, right? Like, we don't care if we're making ends meet, right? And you have to do, 3 or 4 shift or overtime shift to pay for those tennis shoes. You don't care as long as you get to buy them, right? And that makes us rational, right? Is that now somebody's like, wait, that's not rational. It is for Weber, because for you is that you attach now certain value to it, to something, and for you, that's all that matters. Okay. And so what Weber then argues is that groups become very complex over time. And so all of a sudden, society, what we want is order. We want to know that something's going to happen at a certain point in time, right? So think of it the way we started off this course. Imagine the first video you saw, right, on D2L is like, hey, students, what's up, right? Orale. Some of you like, what the heck is this? Who is he talking to? Who is this guy, right? For first and foremost, because I'm not falling into the frame of the language I should be using, right? Or I should be introducing myself to you. Secondly, what if I would start off like, hey, what's up? Welcome to the class. Guess what? We have an exam today, right? Here it is. And you'll be like, what the hell is this, right? Y'all be dropping this phenomenal class in a heartbeat. Y'all be like, I'm out of here, right? Like, drop. Because all of a sudden you have a certain expectation what should happen during the first time we meet. First time, I should go over syllabus, right? And I should have these rubrics, right? And you have these expectations. Like, I should see a syllabus. You should explain what the syllabus entails. When am I going to be examined? How much my exams are worth and value, right? And so that is the order that you're expecting, right? Even if it's on an online class, right? When we get back into the spring semester and in person, you will expect your first day of class to follow a certain pattern, right? And that should be rational. Okay. You don't expect a professor to come in like, oh yeah, you know what? Let's wing it. I don't have an exam. I'll let you know via email the day before we take, I'm going to be scheduling an exam. You'd be like, no, not happening, right? So, some will go speak to the dean and to the provost, to the chair, like so-and-so, aka Professor Molina. Granted, he's a cool professor. Like, the dude doesn't have a syllabus, right? Like, oh my gosh, like, what are we going to do? And so because we're already structural, right? We have a certain rational perception. We expect this order. Certain patterns need to, follow, right? Now, because there's now a certain expectation on when these modules should activate for you, you expect. Imagine tomorrow, which will be Wednesday, right? Lo and behold, it's 11:30 and there is no material there, right? Some of you might email me like, wait, should I do that? Should I not send you the material? No. Anyway, so imagine, like some of you might email like, hey, Dr. M, yeah, the modules aren't up, today's right? Because now you expect that order, okay? Now granted, this is only the second week, but because one, I did it the week before, and two, I explained, I stated that in the syllabus, right? In the first time we met, remotely. And so that becomes the order, right? And this helps us function, right? And so this is when we're talking about development of organizations. Organizations have this structure that we entail, right? And so they follow these mission statements. And so for Weber, this is what's important for us. One is the standard symbol because it makes sense to us. Secondly, we seek order, right? We despise chaos, okay? We despise instability, right? Imagine all of a sudden that the structure said, hey, guess what? No more Nikes, right? Or Pumas. Or for my case, no more Dr. Pepper. I'll be like, oh, how dare they? What do you mean that you, what happened to Dr. Pepper, right? Then all of a sudden that will be structure and stability because all of a sudden now you don't have Dr. Peppers. You'd be surprised how many times I walk throughout different vending machines on campus looking for a Dr. Pepper, right? Looking for a Dr. Pepper. Not Dr. Pepper Cherry, not Diet Dr. Pepper, no, regular Dr. Pepper, not Dr. Pepper 23, no, Dr. Pepper. And so then all of a sudden, that order, right, that disrupts the rest of my day. And so just note that Weber is more important about this dynamic instruction for him is this is what is essential to the individual, right? These two key things, okay? So this is Weber. So now let's go ahead and talk about dun, 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 the father of sociology. Yes, we talked about two theorists, but this is the father of sociology, and his name is Emilio Durkheim. He is the father of sociology. Emilio Durkheim is the father of sociology. Okay, so first and foremost, Durkheim talked about how people by nature were bad. Okay, now this is how Weber is different from Marx. Remember, Marx talked about how people we're good inside, right? We always want to do good. We're taught to do bad things. Durkheim says, no, we're born bad, we're selfish, we're self-centered. If given the opportunity, we will take advantage of each other. And so, this is an example of keeping up with the Robinsons. If my neighbors have something and I want it, I'm jealous for it. Well, I want it too. I will either want something of equal value or greater value, right? So for Durkheim, is people are bad. We've always been bad, and we always will be bad. So what happens? For Durkheim is that somewhere in our infancy as a civilization, as a society, we develop a covenant, right? We didn't make up this covenant, we came into it. What I mean by we is you and I, right? We came into this covenant and we gave power to it. We gave power to this covenant, to this thing that's external, right? So power is external. So what this is saying is that that this power is external, that when we look at norms and values, that is a affirmation of the covenant, right? And the laws. We agree somewhere in our infancy as a civilization of what is right and what is wrong. And so what he's now talking about here is, in a sense, that you have what's referred to as structure. And so when we're talking about Durkheim, and this now goes back to social stratification, right? The 3 P's for Durkheim, who you are, or let me rephrase that. What is important is what you do. So what he's saying is that let's look at deviance, right? People who are bad. For him is that while some of us might consider deviant bad, society needs deviance, right? Law enforcement needs it, or else there wouldn't be no law enforcement, right? This is why the more criminals you have, the more officers you hire, the more prisons you build, the more laws you pass, right? So that is, if you look at one of the large employers in the United States, tend to be in dealing with the criminal justice system, right? I think about 40%. That is very substantial, right? Some type of law enforcement agency. And so well, I think it might be a little bit less than that, but the point being is that it's pretty substantial, right? When we're looking at other agencies and occupations, law enforcement in general. So anything that has to do with law enforcement, probation officers, counseling, and X and Y, that is all fall under, category of CJ, criminal justice, or deviance, right? So that, while we consider it like bad, for Durkheim, it's like, no, it's functional, right? Because it gives it builds this other entities, which then also increases students who want to major now in criminology and CJ. I know there's several of you in here, right? This is good for you, right? Imagine you had no criminals. Hey, guess what? You're gonna have to pick another profession because we don't need people in criminology and X and Y. So for Durkheim, everything is functional, right? And that is what you have to keep in mind about Durkheim. Durkheim is functional, and he refers to this as structural functionalism. Structure, functional. Structure, functional. So structural functionalism. And what he's saying is that even when you look at a worm, every section of that worm plays a role, right? The front of the worm is equal value to the back of the worm. Okay, so the worm itself is not important, or these small sections of the worms are not important. What the worm does is, all right? And so this is where he now gets into this idea of collective consciousness. Collective consciousness, we know it as group thinking, is for the greater good, right? For the greater group. And you hear that, right? Like, oh, think about, everybody. Which, even if you think of yourself as an individual, you're part of a group, right? So think of, those. Now, that is still collective consciousness, okay? Because even as you're like, well, I'm not falling into this idea of wearing a mask, and I'll, the reason why I wear masks is because next week we're going to talk about Goffman and groups, right? And so what Goffman says is that, and this is where now new research is going, is that conversation of individuals who wear masks and individuals that don't wear masks, right? The individuals who wear masks have a certain collective group, and the individuals that don't wear masks, even though they're saying, no, it's an individual base, no, you're actually part of a group, right? Because you're following a certain collective thinking, right? And you have languages like, oh, they're puppets, right? If you wear a mask, you're a puppet. And I forget what other language they use, right? Like, oh, um, you're guinea pigs, right? You hear that, like, oh, you're guinea pigs experiment, like, you like to live in fear, right? And I'm using that in quotation, right? Like, I don't want to live in fear, right? That is the common discourse, right? And so there's this conversation about echo chambers, but that is a collective consciousness, right? And so what Durkheim says, it's okay. You're going to have that, right? You're going to have these collective consciousness, and you need to belong to a group. Why? Because you as a person are not important, right? And so this is the other key thing about Durkheim, is that going back to structural functionalism, is that you and I are not important. What is important is the group or the structure or the organization. For example, I am a professor, right? For Durkheim, me as a living organism, right, a being of consciousness is not important. What is important is what I do. And that is my role to the structure, my contribution to the collective consciousness, right? And that is because even if I wasn't here teaching this phenomenal, amazing online class, guess what? Someone else will be. So what's important is my position, not me. What's important is your position, not you, according to Durkheim, right? And so that is functionalism. What we do is important, and not necessarily who we are, because what labor power contributes to is to the structure. And therefore, as long as someone can do it, this is important. And that is what has value. So let's go back to the conversation of structural mobility. Because remember, we talked about occupational mobility. This is where it gets interesting. What Durkheim said, so let's go back to the conversation of those brothers and sisters, right, and family relatives that we have and know that work in the mills and factories and such here in Pennsylvania. So they lost their occupation, right, their economic stability, where some of them were even considered middle class, right? And all of a sudden, boom, those jobs left. Because Durkheim says, because what happened is that their jobs is no longer important. What they did is no longer important in this structure, right? We can now outsource it. We can take that to an underdeveloped country and have them do the manufacturing, the steel mills and all that, right? So Durkheim says, we agree collectively that's okay, right? This is why we give these transnational companies tax breaks. It's so they can go manufacture these metals, these resources, these vehicles abroad, right? This is why our cell phones are made in Taiwan, in China, in Laos, in the Philippines, in Mexico, and then some part of Latin America, right? Because we're okay collectively to outsource these positions, right? So those individuals lost their value in that particular society, right? And so if you notice that their value, who they were, it was not relevant to what they were contributing to the structure. And thus, for the structure, those occupations became obsolete. Therefore, they lost their power, property, and prestige. Okay. So for Durkheim, what's important is your labor, is what you do for the structure. And this causes this thing called anomy. Now, anomy is similar to alienation. However, the only difference is that anomy is attributed to Durkheim, alienation is attributed to Marx. But the same principle applies. It's a disconnection, right? It's a disconnection to what you're doing to everybody else. For example, as you're listening to this phenomenal lecture, right? The structure is forcing you to disconnect from something else you want to do, okay? Now, granted, as amazing as I am, I know you'd rather be doing something else, right? But the structure for you to get a good grade in this course is forcing you to listen to my stutters, to my dyslexia, to my amazing voice. But that is reward that you will, that you will get, right, is that your reward is that you get an A in the course and that you are able to gain some kind of structural mobility. At the same time, right, you're disconnected from those who are in your family, right? Like, for example, when I record this, I disconnect myself from my family, right? I go find a quiet place. My dog, she's probably somewhere laying on the floor. She's always want to know where I'm at. But that is the alienation, right? And alienation is disconnection from what the task you're doing, and then from the people around you. Now, some of you are like, wait, how am I disconnected from the task? Okay. Majority of you are not sociology majors. You're taking this one class and then you're going to move on to a different class, right? However, you're disconnected from the embodiment of what is sociology, right? Because remember, this is an intro class. There's a plethora of components of sociology that you can explore within the field of sociology. But you're only going to take what you learn here. You might retain some of the information for about, I want to say, 2 semesters. And then once you move into your core major, you're probably going to forget, some of the key things we talked about. Now, granted, some components might eventually rise back and like, oh yeah, I remember that. And you might like, oh, what class that was? It was an amazing class, but I just don't remember. And that is because there was an alienation, right? Your immediate task was just take this class, pass this class, right? And don't worry about anything else that happens after sociology, right? Because that's not how you're being evaluated. You're being evaluated on what you see here. And so that is the anom. All right. So again, to recap is theories are instrumental because it connects us, and allows us to ground our analysis to specifically here we're talking about social stratification with the key theorists, right? And as I expressed with y'all, there are some key sociology theories. Now, these are just the key ones. There are many, and in a regular sociology course, we will explore all the theories. And if you notice, I didn't discuss any females or people of color. And so just note that there are so many theorists that contributed to the field of sociology. The key ones that we discussed today are the key 3 individuals that predominantly dominated sociology in the early development. But just know that they're not the only ones, right? And so, which theory is right? It's always a question again. We don't know. They all have their strengths, just like they all have their weaknesses, right? And again, it's based on what you're wanting to observe and study. And next week, we'll talk about the scientific approach to sociology, because sociology is science. Today, we started off with the theory behind it. Okay, so again, key theorists is Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. We revisit those conversations. And again, the father of sociology is Durkheim, and his main contribution is social structural functionalism, right? Structural functionalism, right? So just think structure and function. And so yes. And the other thing is, I keep saying I'm not important, but what I teach and what I do is, all right? Okay, that concludes today's conversation, and I talk with you all later. Adios.